The second thing we'll look about in terms of typing a fiber is looking at its primary source of ATP production. And this we can think about this as being the second name or the last name of the fiber. So the first name of the fiber is going to be its speed of contraction, fast versus slow. And then the second name or the last name of the fiber is going to be its primary mode of ATP production, whether it's glycolytic or oxidative. And so the first fiber type that we'll talk about here, or the first basis we'll talk about here, is glycolytic fibers. And glycolytic fibers rely primarily on anaerobic glycolysis. And basically, we think about anaerobic glycolysis and we can sort of draw, the different, the fact that anaerobic glycolysis does not rely on oxygen. So we're going to see fewer mitochondria. Remember, mitochondria are the organelles where oxidative phosphorylation takes place. And if we're not relying on oxidative phosphorylation, we don't need to have as many mitochondria. And so glycolytic fibers have fewer mitochondria. They have more glycolytic enzymes, again, because they're relying on glycolysis. So they're going to have more of the enzymes that are required to drive those glycolytic reactions. They've got higher glycogen stores, because that's what's important for these fibers, right? We need to tap into those glycogen reserves in order to break that down to make glucose. And so it's going to be more important to have glycogen stored in these types of fibers. They use little oxygen, so they're anaerobic. And that we know just as a matter of fact. They're larger in diameter, and the reason for that is because they're not reliant upon oxygen. And so if we look at this histological cross-section here of muscle, we can see different types of fibers. So the fibers that are staining white, these are the glycolytic fibers. And these fibers are larger in diameter because they're not relying on the diffusion of oxygen that's coming from the capillaries, because they're not relying on oxygen at all. And so if we look at the other fibers here, which I'll talk about on the next slide, but these are going to be our oxidative fibers. And we can see how these fibers are smaller, but around these fibers, we've got these dark staining spots. These are actually capillaries. And so these darker staining fibers, these are going to rely on diffusion of oxygen that's coming from those capillaries. And so they're going to need to be smaller so that there's less surface area, less space for that diffusion to happen across. Whereas glycolytic fibers don't need to rely on that diffusion of oxygen, so they can be as big as they need to be. And we can see that reflected here in the fiber diameter, the size of those fibers. Glycolytic fibers are also quick to fatigue, and I want you to make a note here of that lactic acid or lactate buildup that we talked about earlier. That's what causes them to fatigue more quickly because they're not making ATP with oxygen. And because those processes kind of get backed up and we start shuttling that pyruvate over to lactate, we start building up that lactic acid. That gives us that burn, and that is what causes the muscles to fatigue much more quickly. That, along with the fact that anaerobic glycolysis does not produce anywhere near the amount of ATP that oxidative phosphorylation does. And so that too will cause these muscles to fatigue much more quickly than the oxidative fibers. All right, so let's speak about the oxidative fibers here. So oxidative fibers, again, rely on oxidative phosphorylation, in brackets, rely on oxygen. They have many mitochondria because this is the site of oxidative phosphorylation. They have myoglobin. This is what makes them appear red or darker staining in this histological preparation here. So they're going to be darker staining as opposed to the glycolytic fibers, which are whiter staining. And that's because of the presence of myoglobin. And myoglobin is the carrier, the protein carrier, which is synonymous with hemoglobin, that's specific to muscle. And so it's going to be the carrier that's actually mobilizing this oxygen into these tissues. And so that's going to make this type of fiber appear more red. These fibers are also smaller in terms of their actual diameter. Again, we talked about this on the previous slide, but because they rely on that diffusion of oxygen, they can't get too big. They need to be at an adequate size to where they're not impeding the ability to diffuse that oxygen from the capillaries that are surrounding. They're resistant to fatigue. Again, they're producing much more ATP, much more of an efficient source of ATP using that oxidative phosphorylation, but then they don't have that lactate buildup, which is contributing to the fatigue that we see with the glycolytic fibers. And then they are associated with many more capillaries, again, because of that reliance upon the oxygen, which is being transported from the capillaries to sustain that oxidative phosphorylation. And again, looking at this cross section here, we can appreciate the smaller diameter of the darker fibers, and then the darker spots around the fibers, which are the actual capillaries that are bringing in that oxygen. And then we can contrast that to the larger glycolytic fibers, which appear white. They don't have as much myoglobin, and then they don't have those capillaries around them because they're not reliant on that diffusion of oxygen from the capillaries. And just to draw a small, comparison here, or a tangent rather, when we look at dark meat versus white meat, in terms of meat, chicken, or other sources of meat, this is the dark meat versus white meat distinction that we talk about. The dark meat is going to be the dark fibers, the oxidative fibers that are going to appear darker staining because they have more myoglobin, they've got more capillaries. They also sometimes have more fat. And then the white meat is going to be the white fibers, glycolytic fibers. They're going to be larger, a little bit drier. And again, we can draw that comparison when we look at food sources, animal sources of meat as well. Okay. All right, let's talk here about the 3 types of skeletal muscle fibers. So on the basis of what we just talked about, right, that the first name of a muscle is its speed of contraction, its velocity of contraction. The last name, or the second name of a muscle, is its primary source of ATP production. On that basis, we can describe 3 different fiber types that are found throughout our body. And I want to mention it here, just so we're not confused, that a muscle is never really purely glycolytic or purely oxidative. It's usually a blend of different types of fibers, but we usually see primarily one type versus the other. Alrighty. And so again, on that basis, we've got slow oxidative fibers, which are pretty much on the slow end of the spectrum. These fibers are slow, and then they primarily rely on oxidative phosphorylation. And then on the far other end of the spectrum, we've got fast glycolytic fibers. These fibers are fast, and they primarily rely on anaerobic glycolysis. And then in the middle, we've got fast oxidative fibers, which are kind of intermediate in their rate of contraction, in their size, etc. We'll talk about that in a bit. So basically slow oxidative, fast glycolytic, and then kind of in the middle are fast oxidative. So let's describe the properties of slow oxidative fibers first. So these have a low myosin ATPase activity, or a slow myosin ATPase activity. And so their rate of contraction is going to be slower. They have a high oxidative capacity, meaning that they primarily rely on oxygen and aerobic mechanisms of making ATP. So they've got lots of mitochondria. They've got a rich supply of blood, so lots of capillaries around these fibers. They've got lots of myoglobin. They're smaller in diameter, and because they're smaller in diameter, this also translates to how much tension, how much force they can produce. And we talked about the idea that less cross-bridge cycles, less myofibrils translates to less tension or force production. And so because these fibers are smaller, they also produce less force, less tension. Then they've got a small diffusion barrier, so they're smaller in their diameter, and so that feeds into this idea that they rely on that diffusion of oxygen from the capillaries, and so they can't get too large. That will make the diffusion barrier larger and impede their ability to get that oxygen from the capillaries. They also fatigue much more slowly because of factors that we mentioned previously, the absence of lactic buildup, and the more efficient source, the more efficient quantities rather of ATP. And then we've got fast glycolytic fibers. So this is again on the far other end of the spectrum. These are fast fibers, so they have a high or fast myosin ATPase activity. They have a high glycolytic capacity, so they have lots of glycogen stores. They've got lots of glycolytic enzymes, right? The enzymes that are responsible for those, enzymatic reactions of breaking that glycogen, that glucose down to make ATP. They have no myoglobin, so they appear white. And then they have a larger diameter, and because they have a larger diameter, they have more tension production. They can produce more force than the smaller oxidative fibers. They also fatigue more rapidly, again, for reasons that we explained previously, that buildup of lactic acid and the smaller quantities of ATP that are produced via anaerobic glycolysis. And then kind of hanging out in the middle here, we've got the fast oxidative fibers. So they have an intermediate or kind of a moderate myosin ATPase activity. So not necessarily fast glycolytic fibers, but not as slow oxidative fibers. They have a high oxidative capacity. So they are oxidative in terms of their primary mode, and they're going to rely on aerobic mechanisms of ATP production, so oxidative phosphorylation. They've got myoglobin, again, so they're an oxidative fiber at their core, but they're just not as efficient as the slow oxidative fibers are. They're slow to fatigue, but then they're going to fatigue more rapidly than the slow oxidative fibers, okay? And then their diameters, again, kind of in the middle, not as large as the fast glycolytic fibers, but not as small as the slow oxidative fibers. All right, so here is a chart that highlights some of the main differences here. So again, a really nice study tool. You can go through these and make sure you understand why these things are so. So why do we see high capillary density in slow oxidative fibers? Why do I see a low capillary density in fast glycolytic fibers, right? Why am I seeing lots of capillaries? What does that mean, right? It means that we've got more of a reliance on oxygen diffusion, and so we need more of those capillaries that are bringing that oxygen in, and so it would make sense that we would see it in slow oxidative fibers and not at all or in less quantities in fast glycolytic fibers. So make sure as you're recreating this table you understand the why behind these highs and lows of the different fiber types. Okay, all right, I'm going to pause here again briefly and see if you have any questions about that. So far we've talked about the sources of ATP production. We've talked about the different types of fibers. We also talked a little bit about the intensity of exercise. And then we talked about the 3 fiber types and how we make those 3 distinctions. Okay. So we mentioned this a little bit earlier that muscles are not purely any one fiber type. There's usually a mixture of different types of fibers there. The proportions are going to vary depending on what type of muscle it is, where it's located in the body, whether it's a postural muscle. Postural muscles are usually more slow oxidative fibers, so they're going to produce more ATP. They're going to be able to sustain contractions for longer periods of time. They're not going to have that burn that we see associated with more of the fast or power muscles, as we call them, like the glutes, the hamstrings and quads, the gastrocnemius. And then we think about the type of activity that you do. So if you're a long distance runner, you've trained your muscles to rely more on oxidative phosphorylation. And so you're going to have more slow oxidative fibers when compared to someone who's maybe a bodybuilder or a sprinter. They're going to have more of those fast glycolytic fibers because they've trained their fibers to rely more on anaerobic glycolysis. So the type of muscle, the type of activity that that person does, the location of the muscle is going to dictate the proportions of the different fiber types that we see. But understand that no muscle is purely slow oxidative or purely fast glycolytic, but it can be, proportionately more than the other fibers depending on some of those factors. Now, in a single motor unit, all the muscle fibers must be of the same type. Okay, so if we look at a motor unit, which again is that motor neuron and all the fibers that it's attached to, so not necessarily all the fibers in a muscle, but in a single motor unit, all the fibers must be of the same type. And then we also want to look at the correlation to the recruitment here. So because slow oxidative fibers are smaller in diameter, we're going to recruit them first. So this kind of correlates with the size principle that we spoke about in our last, the last time we met, in our last unit. So the size principle, we saw that smaller fibers are going to be recruited first. Faster, larger fibers are going to be recruited last. And so on that basis, the slow oxidative fibers, which are usually smaller in their diameter, are going to be recruited first. And then the larger fibers, which are glycolytic fibers, fast glycolytic fibers, are going to be recruited last because they're larger. It's going to take, more energy, more synaptic input to actually depolarize these larger neurons, to energize these larger fibers that are attached to these larger motor units. And so we want to think about some of the activities here that we might recruit some of these muscles for. So again, slow oxidative fibers are going to be involved in, postural activities, long sustained activities. Think about your long distance runner. Think about, the erector spinae, the postural muscles of the back, the soleus muscles of the calves. Whereas fast glycolytic fibers are going to be more involved in, responsive, fast, vigorous activities, sprinting, heavy lifting, and that type of activity.